Tonight we have Chris Allan, and he's speaking on Destination Sitka, Special Correspondents and the Scramble to report on the 1867 transfer of Russian America to the United States. Chris is a historian who lives in Fairbanks and works for the gates of the Arctic National Park and Preserve and Yukon-Charlie Rivers National Preserve. He is also president of the of the Alaska Historical Society. Would you please help me welcome Chris Allan?
Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. Can you hear me well in the back? Very good. This is really exciting. It's the first time I've been in the new Centennial Hall, and it's beautiful. I remember when I was a boy growing up in Sitka in the late 70s, climbing the steps up to Castle Hill on Alaska Day and seeing the Russian and the American military costumes and the flags and hearing the ear-splitting, chest-thumping boom when they fired one of the Russian cannons with a charge of black powder. As you know, October 18, 1867 was the ceremonial transfer of Russian America to the United States, when the commissioners from both countries and troops from both countries gathered at the Russian governor's house to observe the Russian imperial flag come down and the stars and stripes go up. The only trouble on that day was when the Russian flag snagged on its way down the pole and a sailor had to be sent up after it. The officials then exchanged official statements, and all the while an American ship and the Russian shore battery fired 21-gun salutes. And overnight, Sitka became an American town. Most of the Russians made plans to leave, and Alaska became a possession of the United States. A number of participants wrote down what they saw on that day. The United States Commissioner General Lavelle Rousseau and Alaska's new military governor, Jefferson Davis, they both wrote their official reports. And Captain Emmons of the USS Ossipee and Andrew Blair, a sailor on the USS Resaca, they both wrote about the transfer ceremony in their journals. And these eyewitness accounts are interesting and useful and well known to historians. But today I want to talk to you about some other less known sources. Normally when I give a presentation or write a paper, I talk about, or rather I use new sources that I find, but I don't talk about how or where I found them. But today I want to change that a bit, and I want to say a little about historical newspapers and the stories they contain about Alaska. Just a few years ago, if a researcher wanted to find an old newspaper story, that person needed to travel to an archive and use the original newspapers, or scroll through miles of microfilm. Any of you who've done this research know that you can search blindly for days, hoping for something useful. In the meantime, you can end up with blurred vision and carpal tunnel syndrome. Well, nowadays it's different. Online historical newspaper databases and optical character recognition software make it possible for any of us to find and download newspaper pages quickly and easily. The Library of Congress offers the largest database in the United States called Chronicling America, and it contains many dozens, perhaps hundreds of newspapers. I have not counted them. And soon there's a project underway to include Alaskan newspapers in this database, but that hasn't quite happened yet. This is a revolution for research on Alaska. And what I mean by that is that tons of primary source material about events in Alaska can be found in newspapers from British Columbia to California to New York, and dating way back to the 1850s. So when the sesquicentennial of Alaska Purchase rolled around, I became interested in the eyewitness accounts. And I checked a half dozen newspaper databases for keywords like Sitka and New Archangel. And an amazing story began to emerge about newspaper reporters, or what were called, and I guess still today, special correspondents. These people were sent to report on the 1867 transfer ceremony. The job of special correspondent really evolved in the 1840s in the United States when 3 new technologies created a boom in the newspaper industry. I mean the railroad lines that were connecting various parts of the continent, and steam-powered printing presses that could print thousands of copies of a newspaper in an hour. And perhaps most importantly, Samuel Morse's telegraph line, the lines reaching far and wide across the United States and even internationally. Rather than waiting for the news to come to them, newspaper editors sent reporters out to gather it. And instead of waiting weeks or months to read the news, Americans could get their news in a day. That is, assuming the reporter could reach the scene quickly and then file a report at the nearest telegraph station. During the Civil War, newspapers sent hundreds of special correspondents to the front, where they described battles and troop movements and life in army camps for eager readers. And in wartime, news could be a matter of life and death if the battles were headed to your town or city. This is where the special correspondent gained a reputation as part hero, part rogue. This is Alfred Woad, a newspaper illustrator. He's at Gettysburg just after the 1863 battle. And artistic types like Woad and writers in those days were known as bohemians. And newspaper correspondents fit the bill so often that bohemian and reporter was essentially the same thing in the public's mind. Bohemians traveled often. They could be snappy dressers, and they lived by their wits and their pens instead of by hard labor. They loved good food and hard drink when they could afford it. And they were known at times for exaggerating the news, inventing the news, or sometimes for writing what they should not have, especially in the case of military secrets. Walt Whitman was a newspaper writer throughout his career and a war reporter. And America's most famous bohemian writer was Samuel Clemens, and I'll talk more about him later. And because the convention in the newspaper industry in those days was to publish anonymously or to use an alias, there was a built-in air of mystery surrounding the men known as the specials, the special correspondents. So on March 30th, 1867, in the Treaty of Cession, Tsar Alexander II agreed to sell Alaska for $7.2 million in gold. But it would be over 6 months before the transfer of political and military authority would take place in Sitka. And newspaper editors knew that this was an important event. After all, it was the largest land acquisition in the United States since the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Telegraph lines at that point had reached San Francisco 6 years earlier, and they had been extended to Washington Territory and via underwater cable to Victoria on Vancouver Island, but not to Alaska. If they wanted the story of the transfer, a reporter would have to travel north to Sitka and then back down to reach the nearest telegraph office. The editor of the largest newspaper in the United States at that time, well, it was the editor of the New York Herald. But first I want to say that the editor of the largest paper on the West Coast was... sorry, let me start again. What I'm trying to say is the editor of the largest newspaper on the West Coast, that is San Francisco's daily Alta California, he selected a 50-year-old school teacher, originally from New Hampshire, named John Goodale. And Goodale had run a newspaper, the Manchester Democrat in New Hampshire, and was now teaching school in Crescent City in California's northernmost county of Del Norte. He had recently started reporting for the Alta California and using as his alias or nom de plume del Norte. Alaska would be his first big assignment. The New York Herald editor chose the 30-year-old war reporter who went by the name Dr. Adonis as his man to go to Sitka, and the U.S. Census indicates that he was born Stephen Byron O'Donohue to an Irish family in Tennessee, but that he changed his name when he became a writer. Adonis was well known for his Civil War reporting and also for being an eccentric character and something of a provocateur. People noticed his style right away. He wore his hair longer than was normal for men at that time. He sported a mustache and a goatee, and this combo was called an imperial after Napoleon III's facial hair. He was also secretive and conspicuously mysterious. When people asked him about his past or his name, he offered this stock response: "I am Byron Adonis. Where I came from cannot interest you, and that which concerns me before you met me is safest within my own keeping." He also had a rare ability to insult and irritate people, both in person and in print. On one occasion, in 1864, he angered a Union general who threw him in the camp guardhouse for several days on rations of hardtack and water. While Adonis was shut away, one of the general's men wrote an unflattering poem about him, referencing Adonis's Irish accent and his thin frame, and I would like to read you one stanza from that poem. Oosh, Dr. Adonis came out from Killarney to blather the generals and peddle his blarney. The spume of the isle, the gem of the sea, breeds no lizards nor snakes, but spawns such as he. With his weedy flax hair, his weight half a stone in, slab-sided and gaunt, is Dr. Adonin. And you know you upset people when they start writing poetry like this about you. In the months leading up to the transfer of Alaska, Adonis went to Utah to report on the Mormons, and then was visiting Yosemite Valley and the Redwood Forests. And Goodale and he both went to San Francisco to board this vessel, the John L. Stevens, which the U.S. government used to carry 270 soldiers, a collection of livestock, several artillery pieces and munitions, and American civilians to Alaska. There were other Americans going north who had agreed to send news stories back to certain newspapers, but Adonis and Goodale were the only professional reporters going. The man-of-war USS Ossipee was also headed to Sitka at the same time, carrying the American and the Russian commissioners charged with carrying out the transfer ceremony. That's Lavelle Rousseau for the United States and Alexei Peshurov for Russia. Also on board was the American revenue collector William Dodge and several family members from these dignitaries. The Stevens arrived first and gave the reporters a chance to tour Sitka and comment on daily life before the Ossipee arrived on October 18. The first thing the commissioners did was meet with the man in charge of Sitka, Prince Dmitry Maksutov. He was the Russian governor of Alaska, and he had a lovely wife, Maria. Princess Maksutov was her title, and Maksutov was against the idea of selling Alaska to the Americans, but he was a loyal servant of Alexander II, and he carried out his orders with dignity. Maria is the one who reportedly wept openly as the Russian flag was coming down. And on that day, October 18, the weather was nice, and Rousseau was eager to get on with proceedings, and so he insisted that it happen that very day. The following photographs were taken by Eadweard Muybridge in 1868. This is about 10 months after the transfer. And these are the first photographs taken in Alaska during the American period. And this is the Sitka that Adonis and Goodale and the other witnesses to the transfer would have seen. This is a period of rapid transition as Sitka is transformed from a company town under the Russians to a military post and a bastion of free capitalism. American businessmen and opportunists, these men that Goodale called soldiers of fortune, had arrived over the past few months, and they were looking for gold, and they were trying to set up shops, and they were trying to what was called preempt town lots. They wanted to become real estate magnates by claiming land, even though there was no structure yet in place to make their claims legal. They even claimed lots in the Tlingit village and tried to claim church land. These reporters, and there was only a handful of them really, they wandered around Sitka. They climbed Mount Verstovia for the view of Sitka Sound, and they commented on relations between the Kiksadi Tlingit and the American soldiers, which were tense, and they commented on the weather. One called it unremittingly dubious. And on the boardwalks that were slippery with green slime from all the rain. And they commented on the curious Orthodox church services, and on the wild-looking pigs that wandered the streets, and how the Russian-American company had issued money printed on walrus skin because they lacked currency in the colony. And they wrote about how one Tlingit chief refused to lower the Russian flag in front of his house and to raise the American one until General Davis gave him a visit. These newspaper articles that I found, and most of these I think historians have never seen or used, they're just loaded with interesting observations about Sitka, particularly about the response of the Russians and Tlingits to the transfer. They offer us first-hand accounts of events on the ground before, during, and after the transfer, when some amazing changes were taking place. And this is at least as important a moment in Alaska history as statehood, but it is much less documented. The Navy surgeon Delavan Bloodgood was one of the people who was writing about the transfer and sending, or he would later send letters to the San Francisco Bulletin. And he said this about the state of journalism in Sitka at this time. There is very little more to write about. There is very... Am I losing? No?
I think you need a new battery.
He wrote, "There is very little more to write about this place. The specials who came up to do the affair when the transfer of jurisdiction occurred were a numerous and irrepressible gang. Notebook in hand, they penetrated all places and exacted information more or less valuable and authentic from all who would submit to be buttonhole."
You're going to have to give that. Sorry.
All right.
You have batteries.
Sure. Hello. I find these photographs fascinating. Eadweard Muybridge did a remarkable job given the primitive state of photographic technology in his day. A lot of these photographs would take hours to set up and process. They had to be processed immediately. And they give us a real idea of what Sitka was like at that time. So after 24 days in Sitka, Adonis and Goodale boarded the John L. Stevens again for their return trip. And the race began to see who would file the story of the transfer first. The ship left the Alexander Archipelago and sailed for Nanaimo Harbor on Vancouver Island. And it was here that Adonis made his move. Rather than stick around while the Stevens took on coal and had repairs done, Adonis slipped ashore unseen as soon as the ship entered the harbor. His plan was to reach the telegraph station at Victoria on the southern end of the island well before Goodale or anyone else. Without wasting a moment, he hired native men with a cedar canoe to take him down the coast of the island. And after a day of paddling, they got a bit lost and got drenched in a storm. And after a long night, when the paddlers wanted to give up and turn around, they spotted on the beach a cabin with smoke coming out of the chimney. The paddlers dropped Adonis off, and he learned from the cabin's occupant that Victoria was still 15 miles away along a muddy road. So he grabbed his satchel with his notes and started walking. This story was all detailed some weeks later in Victoria's newspaper, The British Colonist. After an hour of trudging through the mud, Adonis encountered a man with a horse going in the opposite direction, and he told the man to stop and that he wanted to rent his horse. The man said he was going to church and refused. Then Adonis threatened him, saying, "You can take this gold or end up in that mud puddle," and the man reluctantly turned over the horse. But when Adonis reached Victoria and left the horse at a stable to wait for its owner, he learned that the telegraph line was out of order. The underwater cable from the Swinomish telegraph station on the coast of Washington Territory stretched across the Strait of Juan de Fuca to Victoria, but it had only been installed the previous year, and it was so often broken that the residents of Victoria used the station name as a verb, as in, "The cable was again Swinomish today, it may be repaired tomorrow." Adonis did not hesitate. He immediately rented a boat to take him the 16 miles across to the American telegraph station.
Now you can have it back.
All right.
Hang it on your...
Okay. Thanks. Can everyone hear me now? Okay. So on November 11th, 1867, he paid about $1,000 to file his story about the Alaska transfer. Costs were high for transcontinental telegraph transmissions at that time, but he knew that the New York Herald would cover any expenses. And then he returned to Victoria by boat to check into a hotel and wait for the Stevens to arrive in the harbor. And by the time he did, the cable had been repaired, and Goodale could file a story. But at that point, Adonis did not care. He had won. He had outfoxed his rival. He would get a bonus from the Herald, and Goodale's full report did not appear in the Daily Alta California until 6 days later. The race to announce the news of the Alaska transfer ceremony was over, and you might think that this is the end of the story. But there is a bit more, and this was the most surprising bit for me. I really specialize in strange and sometimes humorous stories about Alaska history, and this blew me away. It turned out that the editor of the Daily Alta California, Albert Evans, was a petulant fellow, and he hated the idea of losing the Alaska story to the New York Herald. Not only that, but he hated Bohemians. He was known to applaud the Protestant work ethic, and he wore his values on his sleeve. And so he immediately launched a smear campaign to discredit Byron Adonis. This was not the first in-print feud for Evans. Just a year earlier, he did literary battle with none other than Samuel Clemens, who was then going by the pen name Mark Twain. It's a long story and somewhat famous in newspaper circles, but Twain mocked Evans as a fool, and Evans called him a sagebrush bohemian, which was supposed to be a savage insult because Twain was out west now and writing about his experiences. Evans eventually made physical threats against Twain, and it got ugly. So Evans despised writers who he thought offered more style than substance, and he started out by falsely claiming that the Alta California had printed the Sitka story first. Then he wrote, "The latest telegrams from the New York Herald giving an account of the transfer and the delivery of Russian America to the United States are of the extreme sensational order, and to read them is almost as good as a play of the modern school." He called Adonis's reporting a precious mixture of nonsense and questioned if Princess Maksutov wept when the Russian flag was lowered. He questioned everything that Adonis wrote. He was not yet satisfied, and he declared, "The simple truth of the matter is that the New York Herald sent to Alaska a crazy-looking genius who calls himself Dr. Byron Adonis, wears his hair in long ringlets down his shoulders, and is the most perfect picture of the ideal love-struck youth I have ever seen." Evans was not done. In his report from Sitka, Adonis referred to rancor between Russian and American authorities and wrote these lines: "7 duels on paper have occurred, but they were settled without bloodshed. The parties are of high rank." Now, this was a bit cryptic, and it was not corroborated by any other eyewitnesses. And when the Stevens reached San Francisco, Evans claimed that he heard a backstory regarding these 7 duels on paper. According to Evans, the duels on paper had nothing to do with high-ranking officials and had everything to do with the oddball Byron Adonis. Evans wrote that in Sitka, Adonis had been drunk and wandered into the home of a Russian musician, whereupon he insulted the man's sister and was thrown out. Adonis returned to the Stevens and recounted the story, and his fellow Americans decided to play a practical joke at his expense. An American soldier who could write in Russian forged a letter from the angry Russian musician demanding instant satisfaction and a duel with short swords. And they read this letter to the horror-stricken reporter. Adonis evidently took this challenge seriously and wrote a response to the Russian, offering to make amends for the insult and stating, "If this does not satisfy you, my life is at your disposal." And the practical jokers returned with another letter and so forth, so that Adonis spent the remainder of his time in Sitka in hiding, while these duels on paper passed back and forth. Evans wrote about Adonis's dispatches, and I'm quoting here, "Concerning the weeping of the princess and tearing of the flag, etc., these were made up from the same sources which originated the duel, and you may well believe them not entirely reliable." So he tried to say that Adonis's account of the whole Alaska transfer was essentially a fabrication. This story of the duels and the practical joke went first to the Chicago Tribune, and then it leapfrogged across the country to newspapers in states where people knew Adonis, and to newspapers where he used to work. And editors lined up to take jabs at him. One called him a crazy correspondent. And then they reprinted the whole story of the prank. But the truth is that with the exception of the comment about duels, Adonis did a really good job of describing the October 18 transfer ceremony. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't insult anyone, at least not in writing. And he did some solid investigative reporting. His description of events at the transfer agree with all others, and his report was the first into print. Goodale, on the other hand, may have lost the race, but he produced a great deal more reporting on Alaska than Adonis. And Goodale's articles were the ones that were reprinted and paraphrased by newspapers across the country, so that large numbers of Americans were aware of the transfer and what having Alaska as part of the country might mean to them. Also, Goodale was not reporting just on the political shift in Sitka, but about Alaska's geography and natural resources from southeast to the Aleutian Islands to the interior. After the transfer story, Goodale went east and reported on politics in Washington, D.C., and on Reconstruction efforts in the South, before returning to New Hampshire to continue his decidedly non-bohemian life as a school administrator and for 1 year as New Hampshire's Secretary of State. After Alaska, Adonis traveled to Mexico, reporting there, and then spent a year in Hawaii reporting on the economic potential of Polynesia. He stopped working for the New York Herald and he never left California. He lived another 25 years on the West Coast and died in Los Angeles in 1892. Newspapermen in California were quick to report on his death. They called him a mystic and a human enigma, and they reported that in his will he asked to be cremated according to Buddhist protocols. It turned out that the man who first reported on the transfer ceremony in Sitka was for years a follower of the Theosophist Society, a spiritualist group that blended Hinduism and Buddhism and the occult. Along the way, he owned and edited a journal called The Free Thinker that advocated religious freedom and the separation of church and state. And he also owned a newspaper in California called the Jewish Times. And this made me laugh. When the reporters in Los Angeles asked around among prominent Theosophists and Buddhists, they said they had never heard of Byron Adonis. One obituary called him a bohemian with a screw loose. Nevertheless, his obituaries appeared across the country, and I found this one from a newspaper in upstate New York, and it includes the only portrait I ever found. And I'd like to read it by way of conclusion and as a small tribute to a man who played a key role in one of Alaska's most pivotal moments. Byron Adonis, the disciple of Buddha, whose body was committed to the flames and whose ashes are scattered to the winds the other day in Los Angeles, California, was regarded by Theosophists as the most advanced of known adepts or practitioners, and as the most mysterious of men. The funeral was the first that ever took place in the United States according to strict Buddhist rites. The body, swathed in white cloth and decked with lilies and lotus flowers, was placed on a bier covered with sandalwood, sugar, salt, rice, gold, and copper. Solemn invocations were repeated in Sanskrit, and then the corpse was transferred to the furnace, where a heat of 1,800 degrees prevailed. 2 hours later, all that remained was a handful of white ashes. Well, I'd like to stop here and open the floor for questions. I'd also like to say that I've been working with the Sitka Sentinel to issue a 6-part series of some of the newspaper articles that I'm talking about here in this presentation. I transcribed them, and they all are describing the transfer ceremony and events in Sitka at that time, and I just feel that they haven't been used by historians, and that Sitkans deserve to read them. So look for that in September. And does anyone have any questions? Yes?
Can you say something more about Mark Twain?
It was about that kerfuffle between Evans and Twain, and yeah, it's interesting that Twain his star was rising right at this time, but he left California and went to the Middle East and went on a tour that he described in newspapers, and so that's what he was doing while the transfer took place.
Whatever happened to Evans?
I'm not sure about the rest of his. I'm sure he was causing fights wherever he was. Yes?
Do you know the location of those two pictures of a group of Natives, two different groups?
Mm-hmm.
Plank fence?
No, I've taken a good look at it, but no, I can't identify the building. This gentleman's asking about the picture, the groups of Tlingit people, one with the salmon and then one large group. I think they're amazing photographs, in part because they're so early in Alaska and Sitka. And in the large group, there's a young woman with her face painted black. And that was something that almost all of the reporters commented on, was the Tlingit practice at the time of painting in black with ashes, and also red. So red and black faces really caught their attention, and they were speculating as to why, what the purpose was of this. Yes.
If we could hold on here, I think for Owen to record this, we need to have it on the mic. So.
Yeah, wait for the mic.
I was going to ask a related question, and that is, your information in general came from these newspapers, but I was curious as where the photographs in general came from. They're spectacular photographs.
Sure. The Muybridge photographs are at the Beneke Library and Rare Books collection at Yale University. They're at some other archives around the country, but the best copies are available through the Beneke Library. And you can contact that archive and request scanned images of your own. And that was 9 photographs, but there are maybe 15 of Sitka and then some more elsewhere in Southeast. But they're not, the photographer didn't label them terribly well, and so sometimes you don't know what you're looking at. But yeah, they're wonderful, and the one with the Orthodox priests is at the Russian bishop's house. And I went by the bishop's house today and looked at the windows and the walls to make sure that I was right about that. Rebecca?
Bob, take the mic back to her, please.
Chris,
Yes.
Thanks.
could you go back to the photographs that were...
Sure.
I wanted to say those. Son?
Yeah.
I wanted to say that those Muybridge photos they're online. You can Google Muybridge Sitka, and they're in 2 places. There's on the online archives from the Presbyterian Historical Society, and the other place is like California Digital Archives. But you can Google those, and there's some real nice, not print quality, but pretty good pictures. Yeah. And my question was, who are the other correspondents, and what papers were they reporting for?
Sure. The Navy surgeon Delavan Bloodgood was one of them. He wrote maybe 3 or 4 articles for the San Francisco Bulletin. They didn't appear till later, but they still represent that eyewitness account. And then he, a year later, assembled all of his notes and rewrote his account for the Overland Monthly newspaper, and they published it as 8 Months at Sitka. So that's a fairly well-known document about this early period in Sitka's American period. And then there were others. There was a gold miner from California named John Fuller, and he used the alias Freedom's Footsteps. And he sent his letters back to the Nevada transcript in Nevada County, California, where he was a miner. So these are the relationships between random people and newspapers. And I can't think of another now, but we're talking about roughly five people.
Number one, I'm really, really looking forward to those articles, and I want to thank you very much for
Good.
letting us use those. And then my next question, and maybe it needs it might be a reader alert, but once we read those, will we know whether there were tears and whether the flag was...
Every account said that she wept. None of the accounts say that she fainted. So please put that out of your mind. That is a later invention. It's a mythologizing of this event. I don't know who the first person who talked about the princess fainting was, but it's nonsense. What they did after the event concluded is they went, dignitaries and some of the rabble of Americans that happened to be there, went into the parlor in the Russian governor's house and had some champagne. And then there was a big party in town that night. Not an organized party, I assume, but just what was called a grand hoodoo by the reporters. And I also wrote an article I'm publishing in the Journal of the Alaska Historical Society. So if you're a member of the Alaska Historical Society, you will receive the journal probably in November, and it will have a much more complete version of these events. Yes, sir.
I'm trying to find an article from that Alta newspaper in which they charge AC Commercial was on board with Commander Beardsley when they bombed Angoon because Father Duncan was shipping molasses up Chatham to Klukwan and to Angoon, competing with AC's lock on the medicinal alcohol sales.
Yeah.
And I can't find that. You know,
Sure,
and it's like
sure.
we keep, you know,
Yeah.
I'm just curious if that Evans dude was still running the newspaper then, because then whoever that was had to retract those statements on the floor of Congress, you know, 5 years later or something, and I just want to see it myself.
Well, all I can recommend is the California Digital Newspaper Collection, the CDNC, which is an online database just like Chronicling America, but it's exclusively California newspapers, and it has the Daily Alta California. And
Say that again, the California what?
yeah, the CDNC, California Digital Newspaper Collection. But CDNC will get you there, and it's a very easy database to use, and you can set your dates and put your keyword in and download your PDF of that page. It's wonderful. Yeah. This is one of my favorite pictures because it represents what people would have seen from the governor's garden during the transfer. This is the view, and those spikes are the fence around the parapet there. And so this is where it took place and what the people would have seen. And I have cropped many of these photos so that the prominent features are more obvious, but not very much. Yeah. Well, this was a really exciting project just because I didn't know what I would find. I was thrilled every time I found a new account of the transfer ceremony. And then I was absolutely blown away by this bizarre story of the rivalry between two reporters, two newspapers, and the smear campaign that resulted later, and the bad blood and the back and forth. And then the character of Dr. Byron Adonis. I never in my dreams imagined I'd find a historical character of this quality to write about. Yes?
Anything about the native presence that may have been before the ceremony?
Yeah, it's a great question, and the answer is yes. In some of these newspaper accounts, there are detailed notes about how, for example, a number of canoes came from the Tlingit village during the ceremony and moved out into Sitka Harbor and remained there to observe the ceremony from the water. For example, I don't know how many canoes, but it was notable to the reporter at the time. And also notable the statements by local Tlingit leaders. There was the fellow who didn't want to bring down his Russian flag, wasn't ready to put up an American flag, and he made, his name was Chief Michael, and I don't have the last name at the moment, but he said essentially, we gave the Russians permission to do business here, but this was not an open invitation to the world. And so there was obvious frustration on the part of the Tlingit community. But precious little, though. If there were Tlingit people on Castle Hill during the ceremony, the evidence I found does not support it.
An interesting thing, if you look at those buildings, you notice the windows in the top of 3 of them at least. They're circular, semicircular. That takes some pretty a high level of carpentry to do that.
Oh, in the near building in the foreground?
There's 3 of them.
Yeah.
Near top left, one past it, maybe in a fourth.
Sir?
Wait for the mic, Jeff.
Oh.
Wait for the mic.
I'm running, Jeff.
Chris, how long did it take you to put all that together, or how long have you been working on this?
Well, it was really fast if you take into account how hard it is to look through microfilm. So I was able to do this from my desk, whatever, at home, at work. I could, if I had a spare moment, try my luck at finding one of these articles, and then figuring out the real names of the reporters who were published under aliases, and figuring out how many articles they might have written, and just it started to expand. But the answer to your question is probably 6 months, which is fast, I think, for an article. I wrote about 19 or 20 pages for publication, and usually that takes a year, and a lot of searching, a lot of research. And again, historical newspapers in online databases, sometimes that's 98% of my sources for an article these days. And that's the amount of new Alaska material I'm finding.
What are you looking at next?
Well, I'm a little tired, to tell you the truth. But there are some other stories about Sitka in this period. That Navy surgeon, Delavan Bloodgood, he came to Alaska to be the surgeon on the USS Jamestown. And also the USS Resaca came to Sitka at the same time, and they were sent from Panama, essentially, where they picked up yellow fever. And the crews, there was an outbreak in the crew of each ship, and the U.S. Navy said, we need to extinguish this, send them to Alaska. So it was the very first use of Alaska, I think, by the U.S. government, was to try to freeze it out, this tropical disease. And the crews were elated. They were delighted to try anything to try to extinguish this disease that was killing people on both ships. So Bloodgood's job was to help take care of the sick on the Jamestown, and he ended up writing some very respected medical essays about yellow fever, and he's really the early scholar on that subject. And so I'm tempted to write something about him and about yellow fever and the role it played in this period. Even though it's something of an accident that the two ships were sent to Sitka at just that moment, or a little bit before the transfer ceremony. Yeah, so that's all I'm thinking about at the moment. You never know. Looking through these online databases or archives, you never know what you're going to find. And honestly, it's a mystery to me. I'll be searching, and when I find something, it feels like treasure hunting. It feels like I found something entirely unanticipated, and it's true. I have no idea what's out there. So it makes it fun.
Anybody else?
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. It's really a delight to see you, and I'm happy to answer more questions or talk with you at any time. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, Chris.
Sure.
So you want to stay a little bit later?
So Chris said he'd stay a little bit longer if you'd like, and I just want to let you know that the next thing we're going to do is the 22nd of this month. We're going to meet at the trailhead for Verstovia, and it's with the silviculturist. So 10 a.m. on the 22nd at the Mount Verstovia trailhead, and it's with Pat Hewer, and we'll go look at some clear cuts and some charcoal pits that the Russians were using, rain or shine. And then the 23rd, Wayne Jensen is coming down, and he'll talk about William Seward as Secretary of State, as well as when he visited Sitka in 1869. And then in September, we have Mike Morris and Harvey Brander going to talk about ice, Ion Pulno. We'll talk about some archaeology, thank you. And Zhenya Myachenko, close. Onachenko, thank you. We'll talk about Russia and the time of love, and Bob Sam's going to talk about the cemetery. So thank you very much.
Yes, sir.